Welcome to InFocus with Ejaz, Haider. This program is supported by the Center for Security, Strategy and Policy Research. CESPA is an autonomous policy research center housed in the University of Lahore, and it tackles issues that impact contemporary security and strategic developments, and this program is part of that effort. The history of warfare, for the most part, is the tale of expansion through territorial conquest. This is especially true of big empires, but a number of factors have also galvanized smaller and medium-sized states, both pre- and post-Westphalian, to expand. Expansion required annexation and title to the territory. And as the German jurist Oppenheim states, coercion in the signing of peace treaties was a necessary corollary of the admissibility of war as an instrument for changing the existing law. This is why states, beginning with Latin American ones, tried to create a norm against annexations, to the point where at least the law considers a foundational principle that stands at the intersection of three other principles: entrenchment of existing state sovereignties, fostering of peace among states by barring wars of aggression, and self-determination of the peoples, because, to quote Professors Monica Hakimi and Ingrid Brunk, it allows people within a defined geographic space to determine together their own political, economic, and cultural fates. Equally, however, the problem of conquest has neither vanished nor become obsolete. In fact, as we shall discuss in this episode, it has become more nuanced in some ways. Conquests have become small. State X decides to conquer and annex a territory small enough and evaluates that state Y will relent to the loss rather than escalate. It works, though not always, because no one can evaluate an adversary's response only up to a point and no more. But let's get to my guest for this episode, who's written a lot on the concept of small conquests. I have with me Dr. Daniel Altman. He's an associate professor of political science at Georgia State University. His research examines issues of international security, focusing on questions of strategy and statecraft on the brink of war. His interests include territorial conquest, the fait accompli, deterrence, coercion failure, nuclear proliferation, and the causes of war. And he's also developing two books, Territorial Conquest Since 1945 and Challenging Deterrence, Gray Zone Competition and Limited Deterrence Failures. And his research has been published in a number of very prestigious journals related both to foreign affairs as well as security studies. So Dan, great to have you on the program. I actually just finished reading your chapter, and I was kind of chuckling because every time after the episode, I have to decide the title for that episode. And the first line of your book chapter, is the one that's going to be the title of this episode. It says, "Is conquest obsolete?" So that's great for a title. So let's begin with this idea. I mean, slicing the salami, in a manner of speaking, which is something that you mentioned also, is not a new strategy. But it has become more, or shall I put it another way, it's become come into vogue for various reasons. One of which I talked about in my introduction, that you evaluate that it won't lead to a risk of war. It often does. But I want you to begin by unpacking for us why small conquests have become more fashionable. Is it because of a sort of evolution of weapon platforms? Is it because of these international law foundational principles that I've talked about? Is it because a bigger power might, and that's again something that you talk about in your work, might actually intervene in the event of a bigger conquest, but is unlikely to kind of shrug its shoulders and say, well, this is not worth it. So what are the reasons?
Yeah, so thank you for having me. It's great to be here. Let me start with what sort of history looks like briefly, and then get to why it looks that way. So what we see in terms of the modern history of conquest is that attempts to take over entire countries of the sort that were common during World War II became rarer after World War II. That is the big change that happened. Obviously, with Ukraine, arguably, we see one case now, but before that, you have to go back to the Gulf War. Before that, you have to go back to 1975 with the fall of South Vietnam and arguably Timor-Leste, East Timor. And then before that, you're back to the sort of the Korean War and before pretty quickly. But we didn't see the same decline, and this is sort of one of the main contributions of my research, is to show that we didn't see the same decline in conquest attempts to conquer parts of states, both failed and successful. So we still see a lot of fighting, a lot of wars. In fact, most interstate wars since 1945 are still over territory, at least in large part, over places like Kashmir, for example, or Nagorno-Karabakh quite recently would be a more recent example. So we still see that. And even within those, we start to see the sort of larger kind of Iran-Iraq war type conquests become a little less common around sort of around 1990 or so. And then we have this sort of period where most conquest attempts, particularly after the Gulf War, are this smaller sort of what I call the fait accompli as a strategy, where you take something, some small islands or some small border area, and bet that you can get away with it without provoking war. So you can think about sort of the India-China border crisis of a few years ago. You can think about Kargil in 1999, Siachen in 1984, for examples from your part of the world. But we can think about the South China Sea, the Paracel and Spratly Islands, right? These sorts of things are common, and sometimes most of the time they don't lead to war. Often they work, but sometimes you miscalculate and you get the Falklands War, for example. You get Kargil, you get the Badme War, which was fairly bloody between Eritrea and Ethiopia in the late 90s. And so we see these sort of smaller attempts to get away with taking smaller areas sort of become the main form of conquest. But it's not so much that they increased in frequency as that the other larger conquests became less common, and these are what's left. So these have been happening for hundreds of years. There's nothing new about grabbing a small piece of territory. So why exactly is that? So the answer for a lot of territorial conflict scholars is the territorial integrity norm. This idea that it is just sort of wrong to take territory, that this norm strengthened after World War II. I'm not convinced of that, though, because it turns out we actually see a lot of taking territory, a lot of seizing territory since 1945. It's just smaller. And it seems to me more that states are reluctant to start wars, particularly large wars, than it is that they're reluctant to seize territory. Where they can get away with seizing territory without likely provoking war, they still do it quite frequently. Throughout sort of the last 100 years and beyond. So why are states then, to finally get sort of to the core of your question, what has changed since 1945 that has made war at least somewhat less common? Obviously, it has not gone away. And here's the really tricky thing in answering that question, is that about 10 different things happened around 1945 all at once. And you'll find like lots of different scholars will use the fact that sort of war declined after 1945 as evidence for one and not another. Maybe it's the change in the structure of the international system to bipolarity and then unipolarity. Maybe it's U.S. foreign policy. Maybe it's nuclear weapons. Maybe it's the spread of democracy. Maybe it's globalization. Maybe it's the UN, right, and changes in international law. Maybe it's changes in international norms and learning the lessons of the world wars, right there. Maybe it's the territorial integrity norm. And there are a few more, but there are about 10 of these. And it's really hard to unpack exactly which one is why sort of states have tried to more and more be a little careful about the sorts of things that start wars, why we see them a little bit less, and we see these smaller conquests instead. I don't claim to know exactly which one of those it is. I think that's sort of one of the most disappointing parts of my research. I don't think we can tease that out very well, and I don't want to make claims beyond the evidence. Go ahead. Yeah,
I agree with you. I mean, see, the beauty and frustration of working in social sciences as opposed to hard sciences is because we're dealing with wicked problems, not tame problems. You can't really QED a particular issue and say, well, I have reached the final solution here. So I'm happy that you've actually mentioned this, because it expresses the difficulty of actually arriving at something which is going to be the master key, which is going to unlock the puzzle. But your book is still in the process of getting published. So I haven't read that, but the chapter that I read, and then I read a couple of your foreign affairs articles, including one about small conquest, and we'll get to the one that you've written on Russia post Russian invasion of Ukraine. But before that, I just want to know, for instance, you mentioned Nagorno-Karabakh, you mentioned Kashmir, and then, in the sort of subset, the broader issue of Kashmir, Kargil, and Siachen. Uh, are you, in your book, are you looking or differentiating uh, between small conquests which are likely to happen in disputed areas, disputes that are recognized by the United Nations, uh, and where it is more about strategic reasons, like, for instance, China's so-called nine-dash line, and the whole idea of the Senkaku Islands and Paracel Islands and the rest of it. So, do you make that distinction? Because what I'm saying is that not in terms of realpolitik or machtpolitik, but in terms of international law, there is a difference between doing something within a territory, or in terms of gaining control of a territory, which, for instance, in the case of Azerbaijan, um, recognized Azerbaijani territory, but in the control of Armenia, and by extension, the Armenian independent, the Karabakh people. So, because I'm interested, because I think that it's going to be a little nuanced in terms of how the world is going to approach the issue.
Yeah, so great question. The Nagorno-Karabakh case is particularly unique and thorny because it's arguably a secessionist region. So I'm going to set that one aside and talk about the much more common class of cases that look more like Kashmir, where you just have a long-running territorial dispute. So I can tell you that the vast majority of the dozens of conquest attempts that I've studied that are in my data happen in the context of existing ongoing territorial disputes. Places like Kashmir, some of them are not that large or contentious, but still sort of existing disputes. And that's one thing that's sort of interesting, is why is that? So one interpretation, and this is not what really anyone has said in writing, but is that the territorial integrity norm sort of is strong when at preventing states from taking territory that they have no claim to, no plausible ability to say it's rightfully theirs, but it's much weaker when states sort of go to seize territory that they say is theirs. And that's why we don't see a lot of formal annexation, for instance, is that when states seize territory, which they do fairly often, they don't say we're annexing it. Instead, they say this was already ours, rightfully. And then there's no need for formal annexation. Annexation is almost an admission of conquest, an admission that you violated this norm. And that's why we see it discussed in cases where there's much less of a prior claim, particularly the Israeli conquest in 1967 and Russian conquest in Ukraine, where the border was very clear and nonetheless was violated. The other interpretation, though, would just be that states are aware of this norm. They want to seize territory. So they make arguments that the territory is actually theirs, so that they can say that they're complying with the norm in international law while actually doing what they want. In which case, international law has such large loopholes, it's not as significant. So that's the more cynical interpretation. And I think they're both interesting. I'll give you one more thought to answer your question: is how do I define conquest, or what I call a conquest attempt, which means essentially seizing territory, right? And you might keep it, or you might get driven back across the border, sort of like in the Falklands War, for example, some of the wars between India and Pakistan. I separate considerations of international law. So my definition is basically when you take an armed force and you occupy territory in pursuit of an ambition to sovereignty over it. So essentially, you want the border to be in a certain place, right? That's not where it is, either legally or, more importantly, sort of in practice, right? It's not what you currently control, and so you seize the territory. So that includes lots of cases where the state seizing territory would say, well, this was always our territory, right? So we've done nothing wrong. And again, that's actually most conquest attempts. Even some of the ones seizing entire, like if China were to invade Taiwan, they would say that's their own territory, right? They wouldn't say we conquered Taiwan.
Okay. Since your work mentions Kashmir, and since you just made a statement about Kashmir being a territorial dispute, I have a thought for you, and this comes from the fact that I am from Azad Kashmir myself, and I've done a lot of work. My family members, as in my elders, fought against the Dogra Raja, and in terms of liberating Poonch and Mirpur and Azad Kashmir, primarily areas that are under our control now. As far as the United Nations is concerned, and the UN resolutions and the subsequent UNCIP resolutions, as you know, this entire issue was taken to the United Nations, not by Pakistan, but by India. And it's primarily about the right to self-determination of the people, and there's supposed to be a plebiscite. And for various reasons, that did not happen. Pandit Nehru, then Prime Minister of India, even invoked the idea of rebus sextantibus, which frankly at that time was not even accepted part of international law. So Pakistan's claim, or the Kashmiris' claim on Kashmir, from their point of view, is not about territorial dispute. It's about an inalienable right to self-determination. Now, the reason there have been in 47-48, the war, which was an internal war against the Dogra Raja, and then India got in. Then 65, and so 47-48, when the war ended, this was a ceasefire line. And in 65, when Pakistan attempted to cross the ceasefire line, and it started the war, purely in terms of the legal position, Pakistan had not violated the internationally recognized Pakistan-India border. Whereas India, in order to relieve pressure on its forces in Kashmir, actually crossed the recognized international border between India and Pakistan. In Kargil also, it's the line of control. And I know, because you mentioned, I was reading your War on the Rocks article with reference to the line of actual control. The line of control and the line of actual control are basically the same, with the difference that in the case of LAC, between India and China, the border is not demarcated at certain points, or it's not accepted by either side, that demarcation. Whereas the line of control after 71 was demarcated, but it has been violated a number of times on both sides. I mean, we have tried to take their positions, they have tried to take our positions. So would you consider this, I mean, given the background and given the fact that it's about self-determination, would you still consider it a territorial dispute between India and Pakistan?
So sure. So in my definition of conquest attempt, and I don't think this is terribly different from the people who've defined territorial dispute and territorial claim, which is essentially the same thing. None of us are making a personal judgment about legitimacy, about international legal standing. It's essentially just two states, in this case, India and Pakistan, both say the land is theirs, and they disagree about that, and they disagree about where the border should be. It is in no way a legal judgment, a moral judgment, a judgment about legitimacy. The goal is to be more objective and set those considerations aside. And for them just to say a dispute exists, and for me to say sort of one country, right, in the context usually of a dispute, moved troops forward in occupied areas. Boots on the ground.
So it's more about parsimony. You say, okay, these are my causalities, these are my factors or variables, and so you've decided that you're going to the extent of the definition of how you look at it, to restrict your domain only to these variables and not bring in other ones. Have I got that right?
I think that's fair, and the one important basic point from a sort of a generalist perspective is both territorial disputes, as I'm defining them, and conquest attempts are just very important causes of war. And I think that rings true in the particular context of Kashmir that we're talking about, and as well as elsewhere. That where you have two countries both say a territory is theirs is just a dangerous situation. That for a long time now has been perhaps the single most important cause of war. It's certainly up there. You could argue for a few other contenders, like certain falsely optimistic misperceptions about how the world will go, for example. But it's got to be one of the top couple causes of war out there. So we want to be able to study it and understand it and have a definition we can apply across the world without getting into really difficult historical and legal fights about right and wrong and legitimacy and illegitimacy. So that's the goal for this sort of whole research agenda.
Sure. Let's get to Russia, because I want to ask you if it kind of bucks the trend in some ways. I mean, they started with Crimea, and they had this approach about the historical legal thing about, this was part of Russia, and during the Soviet rule, it was given to Ukraine, and now we're reclaiming it. We've got a referendum, and so on and so forth. So, to the extent of your argument, which I agree with, it was like, okay, the Russians have got Crimea, and that's it. But then you got the green men in the Donbass region, and you had up until the broader war, you had a constant war going on from 2014 to Feb 24, 2022. You had a war going on, and it was like, okay, even to that point, it was like, okay, the Russians are, there's the idea of plausible deniability, and they're going to keep this area unstable. Maybe the Russian speakers would control some of the area, as they did, but that's about it. And up until that point, it seemed that everyone wanted to avoid a war, and at least the European leaders were actually, in some ways, even trying to placate Putin. But then Putin decided to go for a much bigger shot. It's like, because we are a cricket playing nation, so it's like, the batsman charging down the pitch and trying to hit it like, in the long on. And that's where the nature of this war changed. I would also like to discuss with you the Russian initial miscalculations and all that. But my basic question to you with reference to this is that, does this buck the trend that you talk about?
Short answer is yes. It does. And it, I sort of had the fortune or misfortune of writing a 2021 Foreign Affairs article called The Future of Conquest that is mostly focused on Russia and China. And, your listeners are welcome to read it and find what I got right and what I got wrong. And it gets some things right. For example, it sort of says that the next Russian conquest is the big problem that Europe needs to worry about, and not some of the other things that were getting more attention at the time. I think that's proven true. It also says that we were focusing far too much on threats to the Baltic states as part of NATO, and also just in general NATO forces in Europe, when really what was going to matter was the strength of, for instance, the Ukrainians, which I think has and we should be thinking more about how to strengthen the Ukrainians at the time, right before the war, the main war started. So those are right, but I still, it is an aberrant escalation that Russia did what it did. If they had followed the playbook that, in general, different countries have been using for the last few decades, as well as the playbook they themselves used in 2014 successfully, and then since then, exactly as you laid out, they would have aimed smaller. And that would not have been particularly easy to do, given the strength of Ukrainian defenses in the Donbass at the time. But they would have aimed smaller, and perhaps, I think, maybe if they could do it over again, that's the choice they would make, right? I don't know. It certainly has not gone the way they wanted it to. Even if they may end up winning in the narrow sense of gaining territory that I tend to use in my research. But this might be a rather Pyrrhic victory, overly costly victory. So we'll see. But yes, it is beyond what I would have expected. I think it's beyond what most people expected. It sort of reminds me of when Saddam Hussein did the same thing in invading Kuwait. For instance, he particularly desired a few Kuwaiti islands and had some disputes about cross-border oil fields. If he'd just occupied those areas and not the whole country, I think that whole situation looks very different, and perhaps the next 30 years of Middle East history looks very different if he just followed this playbook that I'm saying is what usually happens, but that he is the
I agree. I agree with you, but I have a hypothesis with reference to Putin's gamble. He could clearly see that the Europeans are trying to placate him. He also very clearly miscalculated because of poor intelligence or sort of a poor collation and analysis of that intelligence in terms of the US, EU, NATO response, and B, of course, how much juice the Ukrainians have in terms of a fight back. And the reason for my hypothesis is that if you look at their initial main effort, it was a two-pronged blitz from Belarus towards Kyiv. And it seems to me that the idea was that they will be able to actually take over Kyiv in about 7 to 10 days, or maybe 2 weeks tops, change the government, and then the West, as in the United States and NATO, will have to then negotiate with Putin on the next step. But that did not happen. And they had to pull out of their main effort, completely abandoned it, and then focused in the East and in the South. Does that hypothesis seem like, it has some merit?
So most of it, I think, is largely what most people believe, that Russia obviously went for the capital. We don't know for sure how much of the country they plan to annex and how much of it they plan to leave in the hands of a puppet government they were going to set up. My hunch would be that they hadn't made that decision yet. We always like to try to have our intelligence agencies find other countries' intentions, but leaders don't like making really hard decisions until they have to. So my bet would be that they may not even know themselves what they were going to do, and they were going to see how it unfolded. But we'll hopefully find that out from historians one day. I don't think we know that for sure now. It's clear there were massive miscalculations, particularly about the positive strength of their own forces, and then as well as the strength of the Ukrainian resistance, both politically and particularly militarily. I do think there were some misperceptions about NATO as well, although if they'd been right about the Ukrainians, the most important perception they had of NATO was that NATO would not directly intervene, and they were correct about that. And the opportunities to provide these arms to Ukrainians wouldn't have existed if things had gone to plan. So I think it's mostly misperceptions about themselves and the Ukrainians that mattered. Did they then plan to negotiate with the West? That's the one part of what you said where I'm a little more skeptical. I'm sure they would have explored possibilities, but I tend to be, this is one of the basic thrusts of much of my research, is that in general in international politics, we exaggerate the importance of big deals, threats, get pressure, and in general, you get what you can take, right? You either take something or the other side is not going to give it up. Some of my research is about how when you make threats, right, the normal psychological response is not to sort of rationally calculate the costs and benefits of capitulating or not. It's to sort of immediately feel a psychological desire not to give in and to push back, right? That's just how people think.
Yeah, I know what you're saying, but my point with reference to negotiations in the event that they'd actually taken over Kyiv was more about signaling to the United States and to the European countries that we have got our objective. We don't have any further irredentism with reference to any other, going further west. We have nothing against Moldova. We have nothing against Estonia or Latvia. It's more like if you go back to that decision that an alcoholic Brezhnev had taken to send Soviet troops into Afghanistan. The documents that were studied by Selig Harrison and Diego Cartowez, which are part of the book Out of Afghanistan, which is a fascinating book, came out years ago, Brezhnev, even as the Soviet tanks were crossing over south of Amu Darya, was signaling to the Americans that I have no intention of cutting through Pakistani or Iranian Balochistan into the Arabian Sea. I don't even have enough troops in Afghanistan for that. And precisely because of that signaling, that debate started between Cyrus Vance and Brzezinski, where Vance was saying they are not going to do this, and Brzezinski was saying they are going to do that. And I don't know how different world history or the history of this region would have been if Vance had prevailed over Brzezinski, but as it happened that Brzezinski prevailed over Vance, and then we saw this entire effort in which Pakistan became a frontline state, and the rest of it, the rest, as they say, is history, and not just history, but is ongoing, present, and future also. So I was looking at the idea of getting into Kyiv, putting up a puppet government, and then signaling to the West that we have no more, intentions of intervening any further west.
So it's possible Russia would have tried that. I can't imagine that they would have been believed by much of anyone in the West besides the same people who sort of say supportive things about their invasion now. I do think that Russia harbors some revisionist ambitions towards, you mentioned actually the one I would have mentioned, Moldova, specifically Transnistria. I think the balance of evidence suggests that and that they might have just kept going that little bit further. Once I think it's also clear, for instance, that they wanted not, Ukraine is split in half by a big river, right? And I think it's clear they wanted more than just the eastern half. I think it's clear from their initial invasion that they wanted Odessa, which is on the western half too, and is relatively Russian speaking compared to the rest of that side of Ukraine. And that's right, not very far from Transnistria and Moldova. Do I think they were likely to invade even on a limited basis a NATO member? Not really. So Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, and now Finland. But I don't rule it out entirely. Some sort of.
Odessa, I think. Okay, so they are east of the Dnipro, but Odessa, I'm certain that they would have gone for Odessa, but more because it is one of the most important ports for Ukraine, and that obviously gives it its strategic importance. But let me come to this other article that you wrote for Foreign Affairs. Which is about how you make Putin think that he's going to lose. And you make certain points in that. I'm a little skeptical of your reasoning there, in the sense that, that's a problem with democracies, frankly. With the change of the administration, we don't know if Kamala Harris had won the presidential bid, things might have been different. But in terms of continued U.S. support, but with President-elect Trump and his special envoy General Keith Kellogg, and the roadmap that he's already put out, given that, although they have made changes in that, from 24 hours, it has now become 100 days. We don't know whether it's going to end even in 100 days. But leaving that aside, so that's one thing. In the event that the American support begins to diminish, and it's certainly not, on that level, where you talk about Europe and the idea of ramping up European defense production and the rest of it, I have, and I keep talking to my European friends and scholars, particularly in the last couple of years. I am not sure if we should use, for our analysis, Europe as a collective noun. And so once you stop using Europe as a collective noun, then you begin to look at the various state entities that make up Europe or the European Union, and you realize that a number of them are either, look at Hungary or Serbia, for instance, Slovakia, or others that have right-wing governments that have openly talked about the fact that they don't want to support this war anymore. So I want to get your view of, I mean, so you wrote it a while ago. Uh, do you still believe in the argument that you were presenting, or would you like to sort of tweak it?
Well, obviously, the situation has gotten harder since then, primarily because of the results of the US election. But I don't think the Russians would have viewed US support for Ukraine as reliable, regardless of what happened with the presidential election, unless the Democrats also won Congress in a way that was never really in the cards. There was always the possibility, as we saw not too long ago, that the Republicans, neither the House or the Senate, would block aid. Although there are a lot of Republican senators who are very sympathetic to Ukraine. So 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 I think one concept here that's, because you're entirely right that Europe is not one thing, and that you can't expect very much, obviously, from them. The Hungarians are an extreme example, but you can't. I don't really expect as much from, say, Spain or Portugal or Italy, whereas you expect a lot more, hopefully, from Poland and Sweden and Finland and these sort of more frontline states that feel more directly exposed to threats from Russia. And would be more threatened by a Russian victory in the war, with the sort of big players of France, Britain, and Germany falling in between. But I think there's this concept of sort of, and I don't use this term in the paper, but essentially insurance through diversification, right? You diversify your portfolio, and therefore, if something happens to one part of it, you still have the other parts of it, sort of an investment strategy. I think that's relevant here, where if we have enough of these different countries doing this, yes, in a few of them, there are going to be elections that undercut this, but hopefully the effort could be sustained. I would also add that there is I don't expect this to be the way the Trump administration thinks, but there is an opportunity, right? The way you bring a war closer to an end is you have to change the other side's thinking. You have to change the information that they have. You have to change their expectations. And if Trump actually were to sort of decide that he's going to push for peace by ramping up support for Ukraine rather than winding it down, as part of an effort to get the Russians to agree to things they won't agree to right now, I think that would be absolutely shocking in Moscow, and would have actually a greater potential to work than even what I outlined, with some degree of expectation of a Harris administration in mind. Again, I don't think that will happen, but I do think it could. It is an option in front of the Trump administration.
Your point is absolutely valid, because and this is, you're right. We don't know if that's going to happen, but logically speaking, even if Trump were to actually ultimately aim for getting the Russians and the Ukrainians to negotiate, a better way would be to actually ramp up support for Ukraine, and then open a back channel with Putin and say, okay, if you are not prepared to get to the negotiating table because the Ukrainians are, then it's going to be, we'll continue to support Ukraine. But as you said, we don't know whether that will happen. But before I go towards the closing of the program, I want to ask you this question about what your assessment is with reference to the future. And I want a structural analysis. I don't want you to do a predictive this thing, because it's difficult to extrapolate in the future into the future on the basis of present trend lines. But do you think that there is a greater likelihood going forward of small wars and annexations? And just allied to that, although that requires a completely different program, the fact that Mr. Trump has come and talked about Greenland and Panama. I won't take the Gulf of Mexico bit very seriously, but I also believe that he's not impulsive. He's a structured person. He's got certain motifs over the past 30 years that they've been very consistent. So he begins with the bully pulpit. But the fact is that he said that we'll, if it comes to that, it's a matter of national security. The use of military force is not off the table, and and to the extent of saying, which has got the hackles of the Danish government up, that we do not even know if Denmark has actually a claim over Greenland. and then, saying that there is already an independence movement in Greenland going on. Is that kind of talk also going to be detrimental to maintaining the existing norm of no wars of aggression and no annexation, something that, Henry Stimson spoke about decades ago? Is that also going to contribute negatively to diluting this norm or these norms?
So I think it's clear that Trump does not hold these norms sacred. I don't think it's also clear Putin does not hold them sacred. I have very few hopes that Xi Jinping holds them sacred. I could keep going. This is partly why I am in this debate the sort of skeptic about the constraining power of the territorial integrity norm. I would say most scholars of this issue would just agree very strongly with what you said, that this is alarming and damaging and that it weakens this norm. That is the majority view. Where I have some hesitation is that I'm less convinced that it was as strong in the first place as they were. I guess Americans like to think that whenever we do something wrong, it's shocking to the rest of the world. I'm not sure the rest of the world is as surprised by some of these things, particularly the parts that don't view us as favorably as we would, or some of us would like to imagine. And so, it's sort of like Americans always believe that, or at least Democrats always believe that the rest of the world will much prefer a Democratic administration and see the two as very different. But for large parts of the world, they don't draw much of a distinction. And they're skeptical of both, particularly U.S. adversaries like, say, the Iranians, the North Koreans are probably even a better example, the Chinese. So it's discouraging, and it is revealing about sort of the fact that there are a lot of the world leaders that this norm should be operating through, affecting the thinking of these world leaders, and these world leaders don't seem to believe in it. So that's a little bit troubling. But again, I'm not sure any of that's new. To be perfectly honest, maybe for a U.S. president, but for Russia and China, for example, I'm not sure that's a very new development.
Well, I agree with you. I mean, I'm frankly not even cautiously optimistic. I think I'm pretty pessimistic about where this thing is going. And I was just talking to a couple of people, and I said that this entire thing reminds me of Ted Hughes's Apple tragedy, where at the end of the day, everything goes to hell. But thank you so much, Dan, for your insights. This is all from this episode. If you like the discussion, click on the subscribe button. It doesn't get me any lucre, but it'll definitely make me happy. And it also helps us bring you quality discussions. Until our next episode, goodbye and stay safe.